Our topic today is about the history of psychology. Every discipline always has a beginning, so today we will tackle how psychology started and how it became a scientific discipline. So, at the end of this lesson, you will be able to, number one, explain how psychology is a science and why the rat is always right. Number two, describe the three key elements of the scientific attitude and how they support scientific inquiry. And three, describe how psychology developed from early understanding of minds and body and to the beginning of modern science. And fourth, you'll be able to describe some important milestones in psychology's early development. And lastly, explain how behaviorism, Freudian psychology, and humanistic psychology furthered the development of psychological science. Perhaps we will begin our discussion with how psychology a science. To answer this question, let us begin to understand that at its essence, science is drawn by a passion to explore and understand the world around us. This means that scientists strive to gain knowledge and insights without allowing themselves to be misled by biases or some false information. How can this be achieved? This involves careful observation, systematic experimentation, and rigorous critical analysis. However, although scientists wanted to discover everything, there are things that cannot be answered through scientific methods alone. These types of questions often pertain to personal, philosophical, or spiritual matters. These are areas where scientific evidence may not provide definitive answers. For example, these questions about the purpose of life or the existence of higher power, these are profound questions that people have pondered for several centuries and often addressed through personal beliefs or faith system. This cannot be addressed using scientific inquiries. It is important to note that beliefs are sometimes mislabeled as feelings, and understanding the distinction between beliefs and feelings is crucial when discussing topics that lie beyond the realm of scientific inquiry. So before we inquire scientifically, we have a lot of questions in mind. And these questions we want answered. We may be asking about how does one experience stress, or a question about can someone read minds? We are curious. Curiosity is the desire to learn, understand, and discover new things. Without curiosity, there will be no motivation to explore unknown areas and ask new questions. After being curious about things, here comes skepticism. Skepticism, on the other hand, is the practice of questioning and critically examining information in science. Skepticism ensures that conclusions are based on solid evidence and logical reasoning. When we say solid evidence, this means factual information and not coming from guessing or assumptions. Scientists do not accept claims at face value without understanding the deeper meaning or the underlying reasons. Instead, they evaluate the evidence, consider alternative explanations, and test hypotheses rigorously. This kind of critical approach helps prevent the acceptance of false or misleading information, ensuring that scientific knowledge is valid and reliable. This is also essential for maintaining the integrity and credibility of science. Yet, there are times that our assumptions and methods are incorrect. Here, humility will come in. This simply means that recognizing and accepting the limits of our knowledge and being open to new ideas and evidence. For instance, when you conduct an experiment and unexpectedly the result is different from your original assumption, you will have to accept it because it is still a result. Hence, the phrase, The rat is always right. The scientific attitudes that we discussed in our previous slides, the curiosity, skepticism, and humility, prepare us to think harder and smarter. This thinking style is called critical thinking. In critical thinking, we need to examine assumptions, appraises the source, discerns hidden biases, evaluate evidence, and assess conclusions. This means looking at the underlying beliefs that are taken for granted and questioning their validity, assessing the reliability and credibility of where the information is coming from, identifying any biases that might be influencing the information or argument presented, analyzing the data and facts to determine their accuracy and relevance, and judging whether the conclusion drawn are logical and well supported by the evidence. In religious contexts, critical thinking and scientific inquiry are considered a threat. Just like Copernicus and Newton, who were deeply religious, they said, in order to love and honor God, it is necessary to fully appreciate the wonders of his handiwork. With this, it is the end. No need to further study because we cannot prove the existence of God using scientific method. Through critical thinking, we can discover new knowledge, explore myths and misconceptions, and make new policies and solutions that are more effective and based on solid evidence. So, how did psychology develop from early understanding of mind and body to the beginnings of modern science? To answer this question, let us dig into the pre-scientific time, before psychology became science. The history of psychology is rooted from the philosophical discipline. There were early thinkers who questioned how does our mind works, how does our body relate to mind, and so on. In ancient Greece, the philosopher-teacher Socrates and his student Plato concluded that mind is separable from the body. Even if our body dies, our mind still continues to live. Take note, during their time, mind or soul and soul are considered one. This means there is no distinction between mind and soul, or because in their perspective, they are the same. They are immaterial part of a person. The mind or soul is the thinking part, the source of all knowledge, whereas the body is the physical part that decays and perish. They also believe that knowledge is innate and it is born within us. If Socrates and Plato believed that knowledge is innate, Aristotle, on the other hand, argued that knowledge is not pre-existing, not innate, because it grows from experiences stored in our memories. Then, the modern science began to flourish in the 1600s. René Descartes agreed with Plato and Socrates that knowledge is innate. He agreed that mind and body are two separate entities. He also agreed that mind or soul continues to live on even if the body dies. But in this time, René Descartes was curious about how the immaterial mind and physical bodies communicate. So he dissected animals and found fluids in the animal's brain. Then he concluded that those fluids are animal spirits that flow through the nerves that make the animal to move. Then came an English scientist who took a more down-to-earth form centered on experiments, experience, and common sense judgment. I am talking about Francis Bacon. Bacon was also fascinated with human minds. He argued that science knowledge or scientific knowledge is obtained after making observations and then utilizing inductive reasoning to interpret the observations. The idea of observing human mind was the focus of Francis Bacon. And to observe human mind, he used inductive reasoning. That means interpreting information from general idea to specific idea. Then another philosopher that marked in our history was John Locke. He wrote a paper titled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In contrast with the idea of Socrates and Plato, John Locke argued that children are born with a blank slate or tabula rasa, and that experience writes memories. Locke and Bacon's idea have helped modern empiricism to occur. Empiricism is the idea that knowledge comes from experience and that observation and experimentation enable scientific knowledge. Hence, psychological science is now born. Moving on, what were some important milestones in psychology's early development? Here, we will discuss who were those modern psychologists whom have helped further why psychology is now a science. Let us begin with Wilhelm Wundt. He created his first laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. He wanted to create an experimental apparatus to measure the atoms of the mind. Then Granville Stanley Hall, or also known as G. Stanley Hall, was fascinated by his teacher's work. He built his first formal U.S. psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University in the U.S. Then, the formation of the psychologist's first school of thoughts called structuralism. Edward Titchener introduced structuralism at Cornell University. The first psychology of thought used introspection to reveal the structure of the human mind. Introspection means looking inward or self-inspection. Just like the periodic table of elements, Titchener wanted to classify and understand elements of the mind structure. Mind structure refers to the basic elements that make up the conscious experience. In order to understand the content of consciousness, they used introspection method, a method where trained observers would carefully describe their own conscious experiences in response to stimuli. This involved detailed self-reports of sensations, feelings, and thoughts. However, other psychologists found their method of introspection unreliable because it requires smart, verbal people, and results are subjective as varied from one person to another and experience to experience. Furthermore, people's recollection are sometimes full of errors. Then here comes another psychological thought. It is called functionalism. William James pioneered functionalism. He suggested that the focus of psychology should be the function and purpose of mind and behavior rather than the structure. So functionalism seeks to understand how mental processes help individuals adapt to their environment. James mentioned Mary Whitton Calkins. Calkins became the pioneer in memory research. She also became the first woman to be president of the American Psychological Association. Just to give you a short background about the American Psychological Association, it is a leading scientific and professional organization representing psychology in the United States. It was established in 1892 by G. Stanley Hall at Clark University. Moving on. The functionalism of James was influenced by the natural selection of Charles Darwin. It explored how mental and behavioral processes function and how they enable the organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. James' legacy continued to live on when he admitted Mary Calkins into his graduate seminar. A short background of Calkins: the time she joined The time she joined, all other male students dropped out because at that time females were still not widely accepted to attain higher degree or higher status in the society. So James ended up mentored her alone. To honor of being the honor of being the first official female psychology who received PhD. The honor of being the first official female psychology who received PhD later fell to Margaret Flo Washburn. Washburn became the second female who became the APA president in 1921. Her paper was the first published by Wundt in the journal. However, because of gender issue before, it was barred. There was an issue before about male and female, where most of the laboratories were dominated by male experimental psychologists. So then, how did behaviorism, Freudian psychology, and humanistic psychology further the development of psychological science? In the early days, many psychologists shared with the English atheist C.S. Lewis' view that there is one thing and only one thing in the world, in the whole universe, which we know more about, that we could learn from external observation. It is ourselves. So then, structuralism, functionalism were founded to better understand ourselves. Early pioneers defined psychology as the science of mental life, in which the next school of thought disagree. According to John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, psychologists' focus should be on behaviors that can be observed. This is now the behaviorism as a school of thought. Behaviorists suggested that psychology should be an objective science that studies behavior without reference to mental processes. Yet, other psychologists agree that psychology should be an objective science, meaning it should go through a scientific process. However, they disagreed with the second idea, as psychology should also refer to mental processes. They disagreed that it should not be focused on mental process. They wanted mental processes as part of psychology. So behaviorism was one of the two major forces in psychology in 1960s. This was the first time, or this was the time that when Watson and Rayner made a study about little Albert. They conducted classical conditioning experiment with little child named Albert. When they show a white rat to the little child, a loud bang was made. This study has made little Albert develop fear with white rats. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, the founder of operant conditioning, he rejected the idea of introspection and studied the consequences shape. B.F. Skinner, on the other hand, the founder of operant conditioning, he rejected the idea of introspection and studies the consequences shape behavior. In operant conditioning, he focused his work on reward and punishment. That positive or negative reward or punishment increases or decreases the occurrence of behavior. Then a new school of thought surfaced, the one that focuses on the unconscious mind. This was postulated by Sigmund Freud, and it is called Freudian or psychoanalytic psychology. Freud emphasized that our behaviors are widely influenced by our past experiences, including experiences that we've already forgotten. He theorized that our mind consists of three levels of awareness: the conscious mind, which is the one in touch with the reality; the preconscious mind, the mind that contains memories that can be readily accessed, that's just below the surface of the water; and the unconscious mind, the area that stored memories that we can no longer be remembered, that's below the surface. From the three levels of awareness, he divided it into three structures: the id, ego, and superego. The id is in touch with the unconscious mind. This means id are those memories that we cannot recall, yet their accumulation forms to different desires. Hence, id is called the pleasure seeking principle. Who will perform the id's desires? It is the ego, because ego is the reality principle. Whatever id desires, it is the one that can perform the desire. But what if the desires are bad? Here comes the superego. Superego is the morality principle. Since superego has in touch or has a touch on everything, the unconscious mind, the preconscious mind, and the conscious mind, it has a wider perspective. Superego has two subsystems, the ego ideal and conscience. Ego ideal tells us what is right, while conscience tells us what is wrong. For example, let us use the idea of cheating during exams. A day before the exam, your id may say, don't study, just watch Netflix and just find a way to cheat for your exam tomorrow. In this case, your conscience may tell you cheating is wrong. And your ego ideal may tell you you should study your lessons instead. Okay. So then another school of psychological thought arose. It's called humanistic psychology, led by Carl Roger and Abraham Maslow. They said that Freudian psychology is too limiting. This new psychology of thought suggested that the focus of psychology should be the human growth potential, because humans have the tendency to self-direct towards self-actualization. Self-actualization means our desire to become the one we can be, or reaching the full potential. Humanistic approach also emphasized that we have freedom to self-actualize. So now we will discuss psychology at the present time and what are the approaches. So the question is, how has contemporary psychology focused on cognition, biology and experience, culture and gender, and human flourishing? Contemporary psychology basically is the integration of traditional psychological theories with modern perspectives on human thought and behavior. Psychologists in the 1960s pioneered a cognitive revolution. This was the time when cognitive psychology emerged. Cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes such as when we perceive, learn, remember, think, communicate, and solve problems. Basically, cognitive psychology is the science of mind. The combination of cognitive psychology as the science of mind and the neuroscience as the science of brain gave birth to cognitive neuroscience. The difference between science of mind or cognitive psychology and science of brain, the neuroscience, is that the cognitive psychology focuses on the study of mental processes, experiences, and behavior. It explores how individuals perceive, think, feel, and act, whereas neuroscience refers to the study of the nervous system, including the brain, spinal cord, and the neural networks. It examines the biological basis of behavior and mental processes. So in the intersection of two has made cognitive neuroscience, the study of the brain activity linked with cognition. To connect this new approach with observable behavior, psychology is now defined as the science of behavior and mental processes. Behavior means anything an organism does that is observable. Mental processes is our way of perceiving, analyzing, and inferring information. Psychology has come from different disciplines and countries. For instance, William James was an American philosopher. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian physician. Wundt was a philosopher and physiologist. Also, Ivan Pavlov, who pioneered the study of learning, was a Russian psychologist. Pavlov was famous in his classical conditioning experiment with a dog. And also, John Piaget, the proponent of stages of cognitive development, was Swiss biologist. All of these pioneering individuals in the field of psychology illustrated diversity in psychological origins. So, are our human traits inherited, or do they develop through existence? There was a debate about nature versus nurture issue, as Socrates and Plato believed that knowledge, ideas, character, and intelligence are innate. This means they believed in the nature as influencer of behavior. Aristotle and John Locke, on the other hand, argue the opposite. They believe in nature as the great influencer of the development of behavior. Coming from the idea of Charles Darwin, the origin of species and natural selection, some psychological approaches are widely influenced, such as the evolutionary psychology, which means the study of the evolution of behavior and the mind using the principle of natural selection. Evolutionary psychology is a theoretical approach to psychology that explains mental and psychological traits such as memory, perception, and language as adaptations, that is, as the functional products of natural selection. This enables the traits that enables organism to survive. How humans alike because of our common biology and evolutionary history is evolutionary psychology, whereas how we differ because of our different genes and environment refers to behavioral genetics. Then, culture, the enduring behavior, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. Significant proportions of psychological research were coming from the Western culture, where they are called weird cultures. It stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Western means people from the North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Educated, the E. These are the people who have received higher levels of formal education. Industrialized means coming from highly advanced technological infrastructures. Rich means higher level of economic status. Democratic emphasize political freedom. The weird culture, being part of the psychological studies, did not really represent the global population. This is the limitations of the previous studies because they cannot be generalized to the global population. Psychologists' first 100 years often focused on understanding and treating troubles such as abuse, anxiety, depression and disease, prejudice and poverty. But today, psychology still continues to explore those areas. One of the recent approaches is called positive psychology. This was proposed by Martin Seligman. He suggested to have more researches focusing on human flourishing. Positive psychologists believe that happiness is a byproduct of a pleasant, engaged, and meaningful life. Thus, researches on this area focuses on building good and meaningful life. So, what is the biopsychosocial approach, and what are psychologists' main theoretical perspective? Let us dig deeper into the concepts of biology, psychology, and sociocultural. We are complex system, meaning we are not made of one aspect alone. And as a complex system, we belong to a social system. Okay, so biopsychosocial approach is an integrated approach that incorporates biological, psychological, and social cultural viewpoints. What does this mean? This means that these three areas interact to influence an individual's overall well-being. This approach is broad, that is why other psychologists are focusing on different perspectives such as behavioral, psychological perspective, or biological psychology. Someone was also working from the psychodynamic perspective, the other from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. And or someone was also working from the psychodynamic perspective, the one from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic perspective. And others focused on social cultural psychology or perspective.